Welcome, my name is Marcel. I'm the author of the Mockifer library. This tutorial follows on from the first one, and in this tutorial we're going to take a look at the sample projects for Android and iOS to show how, at a basic level, you can integrate the Mockifer framework into mobile applications. So where we left off previously, if you got to that point, you were able to successfully compile the editor project, and your developer environment was set up correctly, which is a great start. So the next thing we're going to do is actually build the Android and iOS frameworks. Something about that, this is something that you really only need to do once, and then you would only ever need to do this again if you wanted to change some of the core engine code or something about the Android or iOS library frameworks themselves. But the way that Mockifer has been designed is that the JavaScript content that gets produced is decoupled from the actual engine itself, so it can be developed against in an iterative way without having to rebuild the engine every time. So once you build the engine once, it's kind of it. You don't have to do it really again unless you really want to. So we're going to run this convenience Gradle task, Mockifer build mobile frameworks, and all it really does is runs the Android and the iOS Gradle tasks in succession. So I've kind of done this already on this development machine just in spirit of time for this demo. You can see here I'm running Mockifer build mobile frameworks. The main reason is it does actually take quite a while to do the compilation, particularly the Android phase, because it builds the C++ code into all the different architectures that have to be produced, and it can take a while. And I've actually developed on a MacBook Air 2012, which is not particularly fast anyway. So I've already done this step. You can see this is the build output that you would see, and here you can see that here's the iOS framework build output as well. But you need to do that at least one time. So make sure you do that before moving on to the next step, which is to open up the sample projects. Once those are built, they actually update the sample projects with the correct library. So you kind of need to do it first. Okay, so assuming you've got that done, we can go over here, and in the products folder, there's a sample Android and a sample iOS project. We'll have a look at the sample iOS project first, so you can expand that and just open the Xcode project for it. And here we go. And over on the left hand side here you can see there's the content that powers the JavaScript engine baked into Mockifer. And this here is the actual Mockifer iOS framework that was generated by running that Gradle task just before. And this is a test application, and I'll just run it and show you what it does. And it just shows how to call into the Mockifer web server, and there's a couple of things that it can also do to manipulate the server directly. So down here in the output you can see that Mockifer is booting itself. It's listening on port 8502 in this case, and this list here on the screen is a result of calling the cats get request. You see we've got these cats that have come back, and I can drill into each one of those and perhaps do things. So perhaps I could delete that cat. See a delete operation happen, and then we get the cats again. I could rename this cat, maybe call it Kitty, save it. You can see a put operation has completed, and we update again. And I could simulate an error. So this has triggered a route that deliberately sends back a 500 error, so we can fake that sort of thing. And I can reset, and that resets the internal state of Mockifer back to the original beginning, where everything's refreshed and all the state is reset again. So the way that works is, I'll just quickly guide you through it. In the app delegate, in iOS we start Mockifer and we stop it. I've attached that to init and dinit from this application delegate. You may find that there's a better way to do it for your particular project. This is just an example. And then if we go into the screen I was just showing you, and just as a note, the code in the sample projects is not, some of it's probably not beautiful code, but I've tried to write just the most basic level of minimal amount of code just to show the concept of Mockifer. It's not necessarily a example of how to write a well-constructed iOS or Android application, but I'm sure if you do this sort of development of living, you would have your own ways of doing this. Anyway, so here you can see that we're doing a GET request to fetch the cats, and that's what caused that table view to be populated. Other things that are of interest in here, when we selected the reset button on the screen, it was actually calling a reset function directly on the Mockifer library. When we tried to fake the error, it was doing an operation called pushing a mock, which I'll cover in more detail in another tutorial, but at the basic level we can define routes that don't actually get applied unless you push them first. And this allows you to set up sort of scenario-based situations, which comes into play for automation testing, which I'll get to in a second. And that's pretty much it. So the application itself, apart from the couple of cases where it's calling Mockifer directly, which you probably wouldn't do in a real production app, that would be mainly in automation tests, the app doesn't know it's talking to a fake server, and the Mockifer server itself is running inside the application. So a couple of things that you have to do in order to integrate Mockifer into iOS in particular. I'm just going to open this in source view because I don't like the other view. So iOS has limitations on calling out to HTTP. It will block them by default. So to call against localhost, which is what Mockifer runs against, we just need add an exception for localhost. If you have a better way of dealing with this situation, feel free to do that. The underlying network library in Mockifer is capable of running over HTTPS using OpenSSL, but it takes a fair bit more setup, and additional libraries have to be compiled for the mobile platform. So Mockifer, as it is today, doesn't use HTTPS, it's just HTTP, but the intent is to use it for development and automation testing, which is usually private, and you wouldn't publish this into production. Anyway, you have to do this step, otherwise you won't be able to connect to your localhost. They're basically the steps to get this running. To actually attach the framework, you would go up to your target in general, and down here in embedded binaries, I've already done this, but you would add that Mockifer framework class into the embedded binaries, and then as a build rule, you'll have a build phase at the end. You might have to add this if it's not there. Embed frameworks, and then you just add that Mockifer framework so it copies it out when it does the build. And that's pretty much all you have to do for iOS to get it working. And I'll just quickly show you now how it's useful for automation testing. So here I've got a few test cases. I've got a test that validates that I can tap on a cat, I can enter in a different name for the cat, click the save button, and when I come back, the name has been changed. I can test that. I can tap on the first cat and delete it. And before doing that, I had 4 cats, and after doing that, I have 3. And this is where I can test that there's a network error. So before the test runs, I will push this mock, which forces an error to happen. Next time I call to the cats API, I'll tap on a button called mock error, and I assert that I get a network error. So this here is showing how the automation tests can be written. And in here, in the setup for each test, you can see we're resetting Mockifer in between tests. So its state is back to the original state. So I'll just quickly run the automation tests for iOS. They do run a little bit slowly, so please be patient. It's perhaps not the most valuable use of a tutorial time, but yeah, at least you'll see what happens when this runs. In fact, I'll just show the console output here as well, so it's booting this up. Now, I'm not an expert in iOS automation. I guess other people might have better ways of writing some of this code for automation purposes. But you can see here what it's doing. It's running these tests now, so it just finished the delete cat test. It's using Mockifer, and it's calling methods directly on it, but at the same time it's just simply, the app itself is just simply talking to URLs. It doesn't know that it's fake. So it gives us a blend of something that can be used just as a development server locally, which is fantastic for developers, but you can blend it in with mock responses, and then you can use it for automation at the same time. And if you've set up your internal server code in the JavaScript application for a developer enough that the automation test doesn't need anything more, like a lot of these are already, then it means that some of that automation work can be front-loaded onto developers, such that if it does reach an automation tester, all that groundwork is already set up and it doesn't have to be redone again, particularly if you're using different ways of doing the mocking server itself. So that's the iOS demo. I'll jump over to the Android one now. So for Android, what you want to do is there's a sample Android folder here. And so from Android Studio, I've got a link already here for it. You want to basically open an existing Android Studio project. I've already done it before, so I'll just quickly restore it. And I'll just walk you through the same thing but for Android. So if I look at the project view, you see here that Mockifer AAR file needs to be in the libs folder. And as part of the Gradle setup, we need to specify the repositories to be able to look into the libs folder as well. And down here, we will compile the Mockifer AAR as part of the compilation step. In this sample, I'm just doing a compile, but probably what you do is have like a mock flavor of your app. Because again, you don't really want to ship Mockifer in a production app, but you might just build it into a certain variety of app. After you've got that configured, you typically have a main application class, and you just say Mockifer install. And it can actually take a couple of options. It'll run on the default port if you don't specify one, but you can specify your own port if you want. The way the Android version works is when you install it, it keeps a monitor on the application lifecycle and watches activities. And once there's no activities left in the application, after a period of time it will time out and it will stop itself. So you don't need to start and stop Mockifer necessarily. So if I run this application now, and pretty much I'll just show you the same sequence of things that I showed you in iOS, but this is now in the Android application. This tutorial may go for a little bit longer than the previous one, but I think it's good to walk through some of these integration points. And one of the important parts of this is that when we built the Mockifer framework, it was all coming off a single shared code base, and the only things that are different between the different platforms is just a tiny bit of glue code in between them. So for Android, it uses JNI to communicate to the C++ code underneath inside of Mockifer. And I'll show you the Java methods you can call it. Well, install there, that's one of them. For Xcode, it uses an Objective-C++ code inside the iOS framework, and that's how it communicates to the C++. So you're still shielded from the internals of Mockifer, but there's just a tiny bit of glue on each platform that you don't really necessarily have to worry about too much. Alright, so we're just going to kick this application off. It'll boot up. So here we go, we've got the same sort of application here. We've got cats in a list. I can drill into a cat. I can delete that one. Go in again. Perhaps I can rename this one Kitty. Save the changes. See, Kitty's still here. I can push the mock error, simulate it at 500, and I can reset the server data. Okay. Occasionally, if you get a red thing like this, you just need to do a Gradle sync. That's Android development for you. I mean, if you've done it, you know this is a pain sometimes. Not really particularly to this library though. Okay, just wait for it to index. Get one more boot in the pants. Alright, cool. It's recognized that the library is actually there, finally. Okay, so the integration points are, if I go to the activity, you see do a very similar thing to the Xcode project where we call a GET request with cats. And again, the Android app doesn't really know that it's talking to a fake server. That's how we would reset the server. Pretty much it's almost identical to the Swift code. So in here we're running Java, or if you were a Kotlin user, you'd have Kotlin. This here is how we simulate the error. So we push a mock of this ID, and that would simulate the error. So it's pretty much the same thing. It's not radically different. And if we hop over to the automation tests, so here's an example. So this is the same set of tests that I showed you in Xcode. So we're going to This one actually has one extra test, which I'll come back to in a future tutorial. But here we're saying, okay, I want to select the first item in the list, check that it's that, perform some actions and make sure the name is updated. We can verify deleting a cat. And you can see here in the setup, what I'm doing is I reset Mockifer before each test runs. And then for each test, if I have to do a bit of setup, I do it, and then I launch the activity. So let's see if we can just run these. And yep, that sounds good. And you'll see these tests kick off on their own. And so I guess it's one of the main objectives of this project was that it can be used not just for development work, but for the automation testing too, and shared between the two. I think that's one of the key things that I was aiming for, and in such a way that, of course, that it's embedded within the mobile apps themselves. So I'm showing you these demonstrations on the simulators, but they also work on real devices as well, which I think is great if you had a bank of test devices running, that sort of thing. So here we go, we're kicking off the automation test. This one we're editing. This one what are we doing here? This is actually an extra test I didn't show you in Xcode, where we're changing the response. We've simulated an error, checking if we can delete a cat, and all tests pass. So that's a walkthrough of the sample applications. It's a good idea to have a look in there and play around and see basically how the application code and the automation test code interacts with the Mockifer library itself. In the next series of tutorials, I'll show you how you can actually make brand new routes, and then from there we'll get into how to make custom routes where you start writing Kotlin JS code and how that works as well. But that's it for this one. Thanks for watching.